Right, I think we should get going, don't you? So I'm Nick Arles. I'm the director of the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first in what I'm going to call our spring series of webinars. Given the weather has cheered up, so I think I'm going to say it's spring in February. That's probably tempting fate, but I'm particularly delighted to welcome Dr. Christina Wilkins, who works out of one of our best universities, I think, the University of Birmingham, in the Department of Film and Creative Writing. Her, I suppose, specialist area of research is contemporary film, television and literature, with a specialism in adaptations and mental health. And she, last year, towards the tail end, I think, of last year, wasn't it, Christina? She published her recent book on male mental illness in contemporary culture, which focuses on gender, suicide, and mental illness across literature, television, and film. So it's going to be a fascinating hour. We have until 2:00. So I'm going to hand over to Christina, who's going to talk to us for, I don't know how long, but as long as you want. And then we'll, in time-honoured fashion, we will take questions, observations, comments from all of you, and I'll do my best to chair that section. So, Christina, I think you have the
I do, yeah.
The con, as it were.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that camera off so I don't have to watch myself as I'm talking. So as Nick says, I have been working on this research for a while now, and it's something that I've been really interested in exploring because I noticed there was a gap in academic research around male mental illness, particularly in relation to masculinity. So what I'm going to do today is kind of broadly talk through some of the ideas of the book because it encapsulates the research I've been doing, the things I've been thinking about, and I'm also going to kind of point to where I've been working, where I'm moving towards next, and possible avenues for collaboration. But essentially, this book, as Nick says, does look at film, television, and literature. And for the most part, it looks at North American and UK representations. And the key thing, it looks at fictional representations. Very often, some of the discussion around awareness of mental health in culture focuses a lot on media narratives, whether that be social media or kind of more traditional news media, as well as kind of general conversations in culture. And there's often a sense that fiction is not as powerful or not as impactful. But I am someone who works in a film department and researches film and television, and actually we see that that's not what we might think. There is a lot of power that film and television has to shape understandings of masculinity, to shape understandings of mental illness and what mental illness should look like, or give ideas of how men may feel they should present mental illness to those around them and even to themselves. So this book itself looks at those representations, particularly mental illness and suicide. That was the kind of the key subset of the book. I'm really focused on suicide across all examples in the book, and the contemporary focus. I kind of went from 2010 to now to lock it into a specific period that explores these ideas and what's going on now. So kind of the very recent past, moving on into that. But really, the key thing that I'm arguing in this is that these representations are shaped by norms of masculinity, and I'll come on to some of those in a bit. And they shape not just how it's being portrayed, but how it's being received as well, and how it's discussed kind of more broadly in culture, I guess. So this is kind of at odds with how we talk about mental illness. I would argue more generally, there's a lot of push towards awareness of male mental health, and having conversations about men opening up, men talking, men communicating their feelings. But that's not really what's reflected in fiction. So whilst we're telling men to do all these things, at the same time, we're not reflecting or modeling that behavior in the fiction that we create, that we consume. And so that's partly what the book is about. So in terms of the background, then what I kind of opened this book thinking about is recent UK changes. So, for example, where Streeting's pushed towards the men's health strategy that he talked about and introduced in 2024, and then the details were released on International Men's Day last year. And that being an ongoing awareness that male suicide rates are 3 times higher than women, and that something needs to be done about that. So thinking about uh, men's mental health more generally in kind of politics. I didn't touch too much upon how it's framed in the US, um, simply because with the changing administrations, again, that keeps getting pushed back, and it's not really foregrounded in the conversation, but in the UK, it has been an ongoing element. Um, the second thing is the kind of the broader cultural conversations that we've been having around what masculinity is, what men should look like, um, and these demands and expectations that are placed on men that, as I say, are contradictory at times. There is words like toxic thrown around, uh, and thinking about what masculinity is often tied to a particular set of behaviors, which are quite reductive. And again, it often focuses on the negative and it doesn't really think about any positive aspects of masculinity. But a lot of these conversations um, can be used in some ways to try and push back against ideas of masculinity. And so I wanted to explore that in a bit of detail in the book and think about how these ideas have changed in contemporary culture if they have. Um, and so I kind of explored that. And then finally, as I say, this push towards awareness of men opening up and talking is reflected in a lot of the charity campaigns that we see. So, as I said, this is the mental health strategy. Then we have things like the CALMS campaign, well, campaign against living miserably. And there's various things. They continue to do a lot of work in that space. One of the more recent ones they did was with Joe Marler. Um, and again, I think it's really interesting that a lot of these campaigns and a lot of the language framed around mental health is around opening up, revealing something. And so it can feel quite vulnerable. And I guess that may be at odds with how men feel they are supposed to be. Movember, and I know I think I saw in the chat as well, there are a couple of people from Movember. Um, a lot of their campaigns are focused around men's health and men's mental health as well. And Andy's Man Club being another one. But again, this um, messaging around that about talking, about opening up, about sharing feelings and emotions, which isn't then reflected in the narratives that we're seeing. So as I'm saying here, then we have on the one hand all these conversations in charities, in cultures, um, but that's not being reflected in um, the fictional stories or the stories that we tell about men and stories that we tell about men's mental illness and mental health. But it's shaped, these norms of masculinity then shape how mental illness is communicated and understood. Um, and within the book, and particularly in the opening few chapters, I start to think about these questions of masculinity. And I'm talking about this idea of these norms of masculinity, which we would call the hegemonic masculinity, kind of the dominant form of masculinity, which is often seen as the more traditional ideas of around masculinity. So that element of men being the provider, of being tough and strong, of being unemotional, perhaps is often linked to that. And I do also engage with this idea of toxic masculinity, mainly to kind of interrogate the word, because the word itself implies there's something inherently wrong with maleness. So again, pushing back against that, and thinking about what's called soft masculinity. So more recent examples of TV and film and TV, I'm thinking particularly something like Ted Lasso, being an example where men are more in touch with their feelings. They are able to take part in activities that may be seen as more effeminate. So again, it's sort of moving away from those more rigid boundaries of masculinity. But that isn't as common. So we still see in film and in TV and in literature, there's still this overriding dominance of traditional forms of masculinity and these ideals of what we think men should be. And I'm sure many of you have probably seen multiple conversations triggered by things like adolescence. That was basically everywhere you looked last year, conversations around this. And again, I think it speaks to the fact that television has a lot of power, and these fictional representations do say something. And when things like these stories come out, that touch upon something in culture or a wider cultural issue, it generates a lot of conversation. But there's also a sense that it should be used as a kind of guide or tool. And I'm not really sure that that's what necessarily we should be looking to our fictional narratives for at all times. But at the same time, it does still shape how we understand these elements of identity and gender. But really, with that kind of discussion, we have this um, messaging in media more broadly around opening up. Um, Again, I used this because again, for the language here, this is someone talking about Thierry Henry talking about his depression, but again, it's that opening up language of it's often seen in kind of opposition to these ideals of masculinity as being strong, as being impenetrable. So we have this really conflicting messaging in culture that's kind of underpinning a lot of these narratives. Yeah, and another one, yeah. So this is an American example, but this opening up again, the same kind of language. So one of the things I also started to interrogate as well is this idea that mental illness, in the way it's presented, in the way it presents, um, does differ by gender, and this is something that's supported by the research. And so there are people, sorry, theorists and kind of academics that think about this. One of them being Hart, and he argued that for this form of male depression, and he says that there are a range of masks for male depression, including anger, workaholism, avoidance of intimacy, abusiveness, brooding, affairs, physical illness, job changes, and addictions. So rather than sort of the more traditional scale that we might look to, or the markers or the manifestations of mental illness, there's a sense by multiple academics and in kind of medical literature as well that men express or manifest depression differently. And the other thing that comes up a lot in some of the research, and again, the more medical side of things that I've done, is this sense of depression impacting a man's own sense of masculinity as well. So depression as affecting masculinity, and because of that vulnerability, because it taking away the ability to perform kind of masculine behaviors for many people. So there's another study as well by Addison Hoffman from nearly 10 years ago, but again, this is research that's still being done, but they found that when terminology in the Beck's Depressive Index, that fun questionnaire you have to fill out if you ever go to the doctor, and I don't know if any of you have experience with that, but they found that when terminology in that scale was changed, that men were more likely to be diagnosed with depression at higher rates. And so it sort of leads to this question that is it that because when we talk about male suicide rates, what often comes up is that women are more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety. But is it simply a case of how these things are being framed, and because of how masculinity might seem incompatible with mental illness for some men? So there's also something called the Gotland scale, which aimed to put forward a range of questions that's looked at male depression and again thought about that change in terminology and thought about how to kind of capture a wider pool of men that may be being missed out in diagnostic criteria as well. So this is just an example of this. And this has been, you can see from here, it's been around for quite a while, but there's still this idea in culture that depression is this kind of gender neutral thing, even though we have this imbalance in suicide rates and diagnosis as well. So this is one of the things that I was exploring at the beginning of the book, because a lot of the portrayals on screen don't also really think about addressing these ideas either. Very often the man's experience isn't really classified as being an example of mental illness, and portrayals are much more likely to showcase kind of anger and stress rather than crying or depression. Because again, my theory being that it's too vulnerable and kind of at odds with what we think of traditionally masculine norms. So as I say, the book deals a lot with suicide, primarily because of this high rate of male suicide in culture, and because of the lack of academic attention towards male suicide um, in theoretical framings. Um, and I'm not the first person to think that actually masculinity may shape how men are approaching mental illness, or how whether masculinity or the norms of masculinity might contribute to this high rate of male suicide. So, for example, Kirby in 1999, they argued that one possible explanation for the high rates of male suicide is how gender roles in our society leave men less equipped for dealing with trauma. Again, another study from 2018, suicide in men was connected to feelings of inadequacy and shame generated by not meeting the culturally dominating gender role ideas. So this idea of mental illness and masculinity is inherently tied together in the literature. And it's not just suicide, but it's also when we talked about this diagnostic criteria, it's not just at the level of assessment, but it's the actual help-seeking behavior. So men are, well known in medical literature, particularly for not seeking help for many health problems, including mental health. Um, so I've forgotten to put the author here. I'm so sorry. I will find it when we're doing questions. But this quote here exemplifies this lack of help-seeking behavior. When depression occurs, there are self and structural expectations for men to remedy the problem or effectively navigate mental health care systems. So again, that sense of self-reliance, invulnerability, impenetrability comes into it from the very start. So not just at diagnostic level, but just even before that. So all of this is really the kind of background to some of the examples that I look at in the book. So I start by thinking about literature. So um, I don't I don't know if anyone's read any of these books. So these were the books that I explored. Again, a mix of American and UK examples. So Isaac and the Egg by Bobby Palmer, Julian Barnes, Swimming Home, and Restless Souls being UK examples. Land Mammals and Sea Creatures is a Canadian example. This is a Swedish example, A Man Called Ove, and an American book here, Little Life. But really, one of the things that I found that when depression's talked about more generally in literature, firstly, there's an over-reliance on metaphor, because trying to talk about mental illness can be a very difficult thing to pin down, simply because it can feel different for everybody and it can feel like quite a subjective thing. Um, and so trying to describe the symptoms and the kind of emotional response to that can be quite difficult. But very often, men's metaphors around mental illness and particularly depression leading to suicide were always of fighting a battle or leading to some kind of battle between prey and predator. They often felt like they were being hunted by something and battling against that. So, which I found kind of interesting that even these ideals of masculinity are making their way into the metaphors that are being used. There's also this construction of what I call illness identity. So, when we're introduced to characters, our sense of who they are is shaped by what we learn about them. But with pretty much most of these examples, the characters with mental illness are introduced when they are already mentally unwell. And so who they are is shaped by that illness. And so trying to work out who the real character is or where that boundary between the self and the ill self lies becomes quite complex, which is one of the things I'm looking further into at the moment. And really, the key thing for literature that I found is that very often male experience of depression and suicide is rationalized. So, um, this is something that that really started the whole project was that when um, literature with women who are experiencing depression and suicidal thoughts happen, that they're often allowed to explore the feelings more and think about the how it feels and um, kind of that's given much more. When it comes to the male experience, the books themselves and the authors take great pains to explain why the men are in the situation, why they are acting like they are, and their emotional experience isn't really engaged with in the same way. Very often, it's written from a third person perspective, so very distant. And some of the female examples are written from first person, so I statements of I feel this way and I feel blah blah blah. With things like A Little Life, for example, where the character Jude is unwell, it's written from third person, so it's Jude is doing this and Jude feels this way, and that puts that distance between the reader and the character. And so it's not just that it's rationalized, but it's also distanced as well. So the reader doesn't get to understand how these men are feeling. So that was one of the key things for the kind of literature. The film examples that I looked at again a mix, more heavily American, I would say, just because American film dominates the film industry, and notably a lot of them really blue film poster colors. Blues kind of dominate in narratives about mental illness and depression, I would say, not just in the posters, but in generally in the films themselves. And these films all explore either a character who has attempted suicide, or a character who is kind of implied to have died by suicide. So that After Sun being an example there, these other ones all feature men who have attempted suicide. Um, but very often it's rationalized to some extent. So with the Starling and a man called Otto, of grief as being that way to rationalize why they're acting in this way. Um, with these two examples here, Skeleton Twins and About Alex, they don't have a reason as such, and but at the same time, the focus isn't on them. So very often in films, the men's emotions aren't really engaged with head on, and by that I mean that the kinds of shots used. So, for example, there are fewer close-ups when men are upset or feeling those emotions that may lead to suicide. We often don't see their faces. We see them from the side. We don't really hear what they are thinking or what's going on. And again, in women's narratives or films with women where that happens, there's often a voiceover to communicate that interior experience. There's often more close-ups, more showcasing of women crying, but that's very much absent in these films. And the other thing is that the men in these films, aside from, I would say, Otto here, they're kind of secondary characters. So in The Starling, you see Melissa McCarthy's on here, but Chris O'Dowd is her husband who has attempted suicide and is in an institution following the death of their daughter. So again, grief is rationalizing element. We don't engage with his emotions. He's a secondary character. In Skeleton Twins, Kristen Wiig and Bill Hader's characters are siblings, both of whom are feeling suicidal. It opens with his suicide attempt, but we don't really come back to that too much. It's more focused on Kristen Wiig's character and her emotional experience in the narrative. In A Man Called Otto, I assume this may be the one that people have engaged with or heard of more. It's also the book. I mentioned the book in the previous slide. Um, whilst he is the central character, he is acting this way in response to the grief for the death of his wife. So again, it's rationalized, and at the same time, it's kind of made comic and dismissed to some extent. So if you see the tagline here, fall in love with the grumpiest man in America. So this man he repeatedly attempts suicide. He tries to hang himself. He um, thinks about using a shotgun. He tries to gas himself. There are, but it's played as if it's almost a farce that he's, just keeps missing out on these opportunities to die. Um, and so those emotions and why he feels like that and to that extreme level isn't really engaged with seriously. So that's one of the things I found. And very often suicide is a plot device. So rather than engaging with it in a meaningful way, it's there to drive the narrative. So in About Alex, for example, and with Skeleton Twins, they both open with these suicide attempts to bring characters together, to bring them back in communication. So Alex, the kind of eponymous character here, try this is a loose remake of a film from the 80s called The Big Chill, if anyone remembers that. But it starts with Alex attempting suicide, which brings his friends together to look after him for the weekend. But again, he's not really discussed, or his feelings aren't discussed in the same way. It's more the group's reaction and how they feel about the suicide attempts rather than, what drove him to that. Why does he feel this way? What are his feelings and what's the experience he's having? So finally, in terms of television, then I looked at again two UK examples, so Flowers and Big Boys, and two US examples in the form of Shrinking and Unstable. So Flowers is from sort of mid 2010s. Opens with Julian Barrett's character trying to kill himself and spending the rest of the series trying to hide the fact that he's done that from his wife and his family. It's a very sort of black comedy, and it was made in conjunction with Mind as well. So the writer um, did work with Mind to think through the storyline as well. So there's that element there, and in some ways it's probably one of the more realistic portrayals. And then Big Boys, we have this dual narrative of male mental health. So the character of Jack here is grieving for the death of his dad and is at university. We also have his best friend Danny, who is a kind of very laddish type, someone we probably wouldn't expect to see as suffering from depression. But I really like this series because it opens up those conversations. He does have depression. He is suicidal, and we kind of deal with the kind of mundanities of mental illness, so taking medication and remembering to go to doctor's appointments and really boring things that aren't often covered. It's often the really the crisis moments that are used in film and television. And then two recent American examples of Shrinking and Unstable. Again, that grief spurs both of them. Both had wives die recently at the start of the series. But like with A Man Called Otto, their behavior is framed as kind of eccentric, a bit odd, even though they're clearly struggling with their mental health and have thought variously. They've, made it clear that they have thought about suicide within the narratives. So, although TV is stronger than its and then the other mediums, so books and film, there are still some issues with, I would say, the American examples of that. The British examples are arguably a lot stronger, a lot more nuanced, whereas the American examples seem to position men's mental health as something that has to be framed as comedic. Because if we took it too seriously, it would be saying something about these norms and ideas of what men can do and how men can express mental illness. There's also this question of genre difference. So, um, all are kind of broadly badged as comedies, arguably Shrinking a bit less, more comedy drama. but it's still often reliant on grief as explanatory, particularly for these two ones here. So that's the kind of the broad overview of the book, what I've been thinking about, and some of the foundations of it. Um, and in terms of further work that I've been doing, I've been working, I'm talking with the Centre for Policy Research, obviously, as I'm here, but I've also been working with a charity called Rural Media based in Herefordshire. We had actually did a focus group last night with some men to talk about these representations. And the idea is that we'll take that work and then create a short film, fiction film of our own to offer an idea of, what would a good representation of male mental illness look like on screen? What do we want to see? What do men need to see? Should we be thinking about how authentic it is, or should it be providing a role model for men who may not know how to discuss or express their own feelings if they are struggling with mental illness? So that's one of the things that I've been doing on the side. I'm really interested in carrying on thinking about how these norms of masculinity shape men on screen, and these kind of conflicting messages and culture that I've been talking about. And that's an ongoing issue, I would say. The key question here is, how can these issues be rectified? I mean, I guess the question really is, can they be rectified at all? And why some mediums like television are able to represent these ideas better. So another example that I haven't included, because I'm not a specialist in this area, but I have spoken to the Samaritans, for example, is that soaps have done a number of storylines where mental illness is discussed. And because of the ongoing serialized nature of it, and there's an opportunity for those ideas to be teased out over weeks and months, whereas the shorter series of television have to work in a particular arc or frame, and so that might be a bit more difficult. Um, and then finally, one of the things that I've been starting to research now is this impact of mental illness on identity, tied to this idea of, gender, because I think gender 100% impacts how mental illness is expressed, as I've hopefully shown. Um, but how we think of who we are as a person and our sense of self in conjunction with identity. So I'm going to stop talking there, so we've got time for a bit of discussion, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of some of my ideas.
Christina, thank you. That certainly does. That was really rich. It was amazing.